September 17th, 1944. 9:47 a.m. Over the skies of Arnhem, Netherlands, 34,000 paratroopers hurled themselves into open air from the bellies of roaring transport planes. The sky turned black with parachutes. Below them, German 88mm flak guns erupted in walls of fire, shredding silk and steel alike. Men were dead before they hit the ground. Entire sticks of paratroopers vanished in orange fireballs. The largest airborne operation in human history had just begun, and it was already dying. But here is what nobody tells you about that day. The man most responsible for sending those 34,000 soldiers into that killing field was sitting in a comfortable headquarters more than 60 miles away, dismissing intelligence reports that 2 veteran SS Panzer divisions were parked directly in the landing zones. He had been warned, multiple times, by his own intelligence officers, by Dutch resistance fighters, by aerial reconnaissance photographs that clearly showed Tiger tanks hidden beneath the trees of Arnhem. He ignored every single warning. His name was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and the reason those men were falling from the sky into a death trap had nothing to do with bad luck. It had everything to do with one of the most explosive command crises in the history of modern warfare. A crisis that began exactly 13 days earlier, when Montgomery came within hours of destroying the entire Anglo-American alliance with a single act of breathtaking arrogance. This is that story. To understand what happened in September 1944, you have to understand what the summer of 1944 felt like inside Allied headquarters. The mood was electric, almost dangerously euphoric. After the breakthrough at Normandy in June, Allied armies had torn through France like a blade through paper. German divisions crumbled, retreated, collapsed. Paris fell. Brussels fell. Antwerp fell. By late August, some senior officers were openly betting the war would be over by Christmas. The numbers seemed to support the optimism. In just 90 days of fighting since D-Day, the Allies had liberated more than 300,000 square miles of Western Europe. The German army had lost over 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. 20 entire German divisions had been effectively destroyed. To men who had been fighting and dying since 1939, it felt like the end was finally gloriously near. But beneath that euphoria, a catastrophic problem was quietly strangling the Allied advance. Logistics. Every single tank shell, gallon of fuel, and loaf of bread being consumed by 4 Allied army groups had to travel from the beaches of Normandy across hundreds of miles of liberated territory, with no functioning railroads, no established supply depots, and roads that were being bombed to rubble, even as convoys tried to use them. The Red Ball Express. The famous convoy system of American trucks running 24 hours a day was moving 12,000 tons of supplies per day, and it still was not enough. By early September 1944, George Patton's Third Army had ground to a complete halt in eastern France. Not because of German resistance, because it had run completely out of gasoline. The Allied advance was running on borrowed time, and everyone at the top knew it. It was into this volatile mixture of triumph and desperation that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery chose to light a match. Montgomery was not a man who dealt well with being second. During the Normandy campaign, he had served as overall ground commander of all Allied forces, with Eisenhower as supreme commander above him, but not directly managing day-to-day ground operations. Then, on September 1, 1944, Eisenhower formally assumed direct control of all ground forces. Montgomery was reduced from overall ground commander to commander of the 21st Army Group, just one of 4 army groups equal in authority to American generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. For a man of Montgomery's ego, this was not merely a demotion. It was a humiliation. Montgomery had spent his entire career cultivating the image of Britain's greatest living general. He had beaten Rommel at El Alamein. He had commanded the Normandy landings. He wore his famous black beret everywhere, staged theatrical press conferences, demanded absolute obedience from subordinates, and carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed history had reserved a special place for him. To now stand equal with Bradley, an American general he privately considered inferior, was almost more than he could bear. So Montgomery did what Montgomery always did when he wanted something. He pushed. In the first days of September 1944, he presented Eisenhower with a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending entirely on whether you believe the German army was already finished. The plan was called a single concentrated thrust. Montgomery proposed that every available Allied supply of fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcement be funneled exclusively to his 21st Army Group in the north. Not split between 4 army groups. Not distributed across a broad front. Everything to Montgomery. Patton would stop. Bradley would stop. The entire American effort in central and southern France would simply freeze in place. With that absolute concentration of power, Montgomery would drive a single massive armored spearhead north through the Netherlands, cross the Rhine River, seize the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, and possibly drive all the way to Berlin itself. End the war before Christmas. One blow. His blow. The plan was in purely theoretical terms not completely insane. Napoleon had won entire campaigns by concentrating overwhelming force at a single decisive point. But Napoleon had not been managing a 4-nation coalition army spread across 400 miles of front, dependent on a single supply chain that was already failing under its current load. Eisenhower rejected the plan immediately. He replied to Montgomery with careful, measured language explaining that the broad front strategy was essential, that all Allied armies needed to advance simultaneously to prevent the Germans from concentrating their defenses, and that the logistics simply could not support what Montgomery was proposing. Montgomery read the rejection, set it aside, and wrote back more forcefully. Then he wrote again, and again. The volume of messages from Montgomery's headquarters demanding priority treatment became so relentless that even members of Eisenhower's own staff were exhausted by it. But Montgomery was just getting started. On September 4, 1944, Eisenhower received a document from Montgomery that stopped him cold. Sitting at his desk in his headquarters in Granville, France, Eisenhower unfolded the papers and began reading. The proposal inside was extraordinary. Montgomery was suggesting the creation of a new command position called Allied Land Forces Commander, a role that would sit between Eisenhower and the individual Army Group commanders, with direct operational control of all Allied ground forces. Eisenhower did not need to see the name written down to understand what he was reading. Montgomery was proposing to take operational command of the entire war in Western Europe. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, would be elevated to a ceremonial strategic role, stripped of real power, turned into a figurehead while a British field marshal ran the actual fighting. Eisenhower put the papers on his desk, turned to his chief of staff, and said words that became legendary among those present. He said Montgomery was trying to fire him. This was no longer a disagreement about strategy. This was an attempted coup. In the middle of an active war, against the Supreme Allied Commander of the most powerful military coalition in history, Eisenhower's response was immediate. He arranged a face-to-face meeting. On September 5, 1944, Montgomery flew to Brussels to confront Eisenhower in person. The meeting began badly and descended rapidly into something that no official report dared describe accurately. Montgomery, standing across from the Supreme Allied Commander, produced a bundle of Eisenhower's recent communications and tore them apart in front of him. He shouted. He demanded. He insisted that Eisenhower was throwing away victory by clinging to American caution. Eisenhower reached out, placed his hand firmly on Montgomery's shoulder, and said in a voice that ended the shouting, "Calm down, Monty. You cannot speak to me like that. I am your superior." The room went silent. Montgomery left the meeting without getting what he wanted. He flew back to his headquarters. And then he picked up a secure communications line and placed a call not to Allied headquarters. Not to any military authority. He bypassed the entire chain of command and sent a secret cable directly to number 10 Downing Street. Directly to Winston Churchill. The cable was carefully worded. Diplomatic on the surface. Devastating underneath. Montgomery told the Prime Minister that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was squandering the victory won at Normandy, that the war could be ended within weeks if resources were properly concentrated, that American caution was rooted not in military wisdom, but in political anxiety about sharing credit with Britain. And buried in the careful phrasing was a threat. If his recommendations continued to be ignored, Montgomery was prepared to escalate. He was prepared to resign. Churchill read the cable at his desk in London on the morning of September 6, 1944. His private secretary, John Colville, was in the room. According to Colville's diary, Churchill read to the end, set the papers carefully on his desk, and looked up. He said, "Monty has just lit the fuse to a powder keg." Within hours, British newspapers began running stories critical of the American command. Headlines suggested that excessive caution from Eisenhower's headquarters was allowing Germany time to recover, that a golden opportunity was being squandered. The stories cited no sources because they did not need to. The leaks were coming directly from Montgomery's staff. Public opinion in Britain ignited. Montgomery was a national hero. His photograph was in every newspaper. His face was on cigarette cards and commemorative prints. Ordinary British people who had been enduring 6 years of war rationing, bombing, and loss believed in Montgomery the way they believed in Churchill himself. And now their hero was being undermined by American generals who had arrived late to the fight and wanted to call the shots. In France, Eisenhower contacted General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and reported the situation with clinical precision. Eisenhower laid out what had happened: the command proposal, the secret cable to Churchill, the newspaper leaks, the threat of resignation. Marshall listened. Then he told Eisenhower that if Montgomery wanted to resign, he should be allowed to resign. But if Eisenhower yielded to this kind of pressure, he would face a rebellion from every American general on the continent. Marshall made it clear that the United States would not permit British political pressure to override American operational judgment. And if Montgomery needed to be removed from command, Marshall would personally take that case to the president. Eisenhower had his backing. Now he needed a solution that would not shatter the coalition. Churchill understood the stakes more clearly than anyone. Britain needed America. Not just for this war, but for everything that would come after. The Soviet Union was already pressing against Eastern Europe. The post-war world was going to be shaped in the next 12 months, and Britain could not shape it alone. If Churchill sided openly with Montgomery, and Eisenhower rejected that position, President Roosevelt might begin to question whether the British were reliable partners. But if Churchill sided with Eisenhower, and Montgomery resigned in fury, the British public would be watching. On September 12, 1944, Churchill flew to France to meet Eisenhower at his headquarters in Versailles. The meeting was private, no official minutes were recorded, but through the memoirs and diaries of those closest to both men, what happened in that room can be reconstructed with reasonable certainty. Churchill listened as Eisenhower laid out his case. Point by point, methodically, the broad front strategy offered the greatest chance of victory with the fewest casualties. It prevented the Germans from concentrating against a single exposed spearhead. It kept the American armies fighting, rather than sitting idle, while one British army group carried the entire load of the war. And if Montgomery's single thrust failed, there would be no fallback, no second option, nothing left in reserve. Churchill made his decision. He would not support Montgomery's extreme proposal. He would not endorse the command restructuring. He would not back the single thrust to the exclusion of all other operations. But he needed to give Montgomery something large enough to satisfy British public opinion, something bold enough to look like the decisive British stroke that Montgomery had been demanding, something that would let Montgomery save face without actually giving him the power he was trying to seize. The compromise that emerged from that meeting in Versailles would send 34,000 men into the sky over Arnhem 13 days later. It was called Operation Market Garden, and as those paratroopers fell burning from the September sky as the SS Panzer divisions that Montgomery had been warned about rolled their Tiger tanks toward the landing zones, the question that would haunt British military history for decades was already forming in the smoke above the Rhine. Had Churchill just saved the alliance? Or had he just handed Montgomery enough rope to hang 34,000 men? In Part 2, we will see exactly what happened when Market Garden met the German defenders nobody wanted to acknowledge were there, and how the catastrophe at Arnhem forced Churchill into the most painful military admission of his entire career. September 12, 1944. Versailles, France. Eisenhower's headquarters. 13 days earlier, Churchill had walked out of that meeting with a compromise in his pocket and a plan that was supposed to save the alliance. Operation Market Garden. 34,000 paratroopers. The largest airborne operation in human history. A bold British stroke that would silence Montgomery's critics, satisfy the public back home, and prove once and for all that the 21st Army Group could deliver the decisive blow Montgomery had been promising for months. Churchill had bought Montgomery exactly what he wanted: a chance. A real chance with real resources, real airborne divisions, and real supply priority. What he did not know, what nobody outside Montgomery's inner circle was allowed to discuss, was that intelligence officers at 1st Allied Airborne Army Headquarters had already flagged a catastrophic problem. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, taken just 4 days before the operation was scheduled to launch, showed something that should have stopped everything cold. Parked beneath the trees and farm buildings in the fields surrounding Arnhem, hidden but unmistakably visible to trained eyes, were the distinctive shapes of German armor. Not scattered remnants, not broken vehicles abandoned in retreat. Full operational tank formations, SS Panzer divisions, refitting, rearming, and waiting. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer who compiled the photographs and the supporting reports, brought his findings directly to the commanders planning Market Garden. He was told the intelligence was unreliable. He was told the Germans were too exhausted to pose a serious threat. He was told with increasing impatience to stop raising concerns that were undermining the confidence of the troops. When Urquhart persisted, he was removed from his position on medical grounds, sent away, silenced. Montgomery never changed the plan. On September 17, 1944, at 9:47 in the morning, the sky above the Netherlands, filled with parachutes, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's gamble began paying its price in blood. The southern bridges fell quickly. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions seized their objectives with skill and speed, completing their assigned missions ahead of schedule. Along the 64-mile corridor that the ground forces needed to drive through, the Americans held their ground against fierce German counterattacks and kept the road open at enormous cost. They did exactly what they were asked to do. At Arnhem, everything went wrong. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped 6 miles from the bridge, far outside effective range, because Montgomery's planners had refused to use drop zones closer to the objective, citing anti-aircraft risk. By the time the lead battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost fought its way to the northern end of Arnhem Bridge on foot, the SS Panzer divisions that Urquhart had photographed were already moving. Within hours, Frost's 700 men were surrounded, cut off, encircled by tanks, armored cars, and veteran SS infantry who had been waiting, rested and fully armed, for exactly this opportunity. For 9 days, the men of the 1st Airborne Division fought in the ruins of Arnhem, with ammunition running out, food exhausted, and radio sets that failed to reach their own headquarters. The ground relief column, XX Corps, hammered its way up a single road that became known simply as Hell's Highway, losing vehicles and men to ambushes at every crossroads. They reached the southern end of Arnhem Bridge too late. The bridge had already fallen. Frost's men were gone, killed or captured. When the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were evacuated across the Rhine on the night of September 25th, exactly 11,900 men had gone in. Just under 2,400 came out. More than 1,400 were killed. 6,000 were taken prisoner. The rest were missing. Montgomery called it 90% successful. When those words reached London, Winston Churchill was sitting in the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street, reading the casualty figures. He read the 90% claim. He set the report down on the table. According to Alan Brooks' diary, the room was very quiet for a long moment. Churchill then said something that would echo through the inner circles of British leadership for the remainder of the war. He said Eisenhower was right. Those 3 words carried the weight of everything that had happened since September 1st. The command crisis, the secret cable to Downing Street, the newspaper leaks, the threats of resignation, the meeting in Versailles, the compromise, the 34,000 men in the sky. All of it compressed into an admission that the man Montgomery had accused of cowardice and caution had in fact been the only person in the room who understood the actual situation. But Churchill's private admission did not end the crisis. It transformed it. Montgomery was not finished. He accepted no responsibility for the failure at Arnhem. In his reports to the government, he attributed the shortfall to American delays on the southern corridor, to inadequate air support to poor weather. The intelligence reports about the panzer divisions that had been suppressed before the operation were not mentioned. The removal of Major Urquhart was not discussed. The decision to drop 6 miles from the bridge was not examined. Montgomery filed his 90% claim and moved on. The tension that had been held just below the surface of Allied headquarters since September now spread through the entire command structure like a fracture running through ice. Bradley was furious. Patton was openly contemptuous. American officers who had watched their armies halt and starve for fuel while Montgomery consumed priority supplies for Market Garden now felt fully vindicated in their suspicions that British operational judgment was overrated and British political pressure on Eisenhower was dangerous. Eisenhower said nothing publicly. He absorbed the anger from his American generals, maintained his position as supreme commander, and continued to enforce the broad front strategy with a patience that his subordinates on both sides of the Atlantic frequently mistook for weakness. It was not weakness. It was the calculated discipline of a man who understood that the alliance itself was the most important weapon the Allies possessed, and that losing it would cost more than any battle. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. At 5:30 in the morning, more than 200,000 German troops erupted through the dense forest of the Ardennes in the largest German offensive operation since 1940. 300 tanks punched through thinly held American lines in dense fog that grounded Allied air support entirely. American divisions were overrun, encircled, and driven back in confusion. A dangerous bulge 60 miles deep tore into the Allied front. The situation was critical. Eisenhower made a decision that required genuine political courage. He temporarily placed Montgomery in command of the entire northern shoulder of the bulge, including the U.S. First Army and the U.S. Ninth Army, more than 300,000 American soldiers placed under British command in the middle of a crisis. Eisenhower did this not because he trusted Montgomery's judgment unconditionally, but because it was operationally correct to unify the Northern Command under one commander, and Montgomery happened to be in position. Montgomery performed well. He stabilized the northern shoulder. He coordinated the defensive line with professionalism and genuine military competence. The northern flank held. Then on January 7, 1945, with the Battle of the Bulge still raging in its final phase, Montgomery held a press conference. He stood before the assembled journalists with his beret and his composed expression, and he explained how he had assessed the situation, taken control, and organized the Allied forces to meet the German threat. He praised the fighting qualities of the British and American soldiers. He was careful not to use names. He did not need to. Every journalist in the room understood that when Montgomery described the chaos before his arrival and the order that followed, he was describing Bradley and Patton as the chaos. The American press caught fire within 24 hours. Headlines across the United States described the press conference as a direct insult to the American commanders who had borne the heaviest fighting of the entire Bulge campaign. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne, surrounded for 8 days without relief and refusing to surrender, had been almost entirely American. The divisions that had absorbed the initial German assault and slowed the advance long enough for reserves to form had been almost entirely American. The casualties had been almost entirely American. Bradley sent Eisenhower a message that was not diplomatic. He told Eisenhower that if Montgomery was not reined in immediately, he would request a transfer. Patton's language was considerably less restrained. Eisenhower was now facing the collapse of his command structure from inside. Not from German pressure, from British-American friction generated by one man who could not stop his own instinct to claim the room. Churchill acted before Eisenhower was forced to. On January 18, 1945, he stood before the House of Commons and delivered a speech about the Ardennes campaign that was as precisely targeted as any military operation. He described the courage of the American soldiers in terms that left no room for interpretation. He gave specific numbers. He stated plainly that American forces had suffered by far the greatest share of the casualties in the Bulge fighting and had delivered the decisive counterstrokes that ended the German offensive. He praised Bradley by name. He praised the fighting quality of American divisions with a specificity and warmth that made it impossible for any journalist to frame the speech as polite diplomatic noise. Washington responded immediately. The anger in the American press cooled. Bradley received the message that London understood what his armies had accomplished. The crisis subsided. Montgomery was quietly ordered to issue a corrective statement praising American forces. He complied. The statement was published. The controversy retreated from the front pages. But the damage was real, and everyone who mattered knew it. Churchill now understood with a clarity that had cost nearly 10,000 British paratroopers to earn that every single decision Montgomery had made since September 1st had followed the same pattern. The bold proposal that minimized risk, the refusal to hear contrary intelligence, the selective credit when things succeeded, the distributed blame when they failed. And Churchill understood something else now. Something that had been forming slowly since the meeting in Versailles, confirmed by Arnhem, confirmed again by the press conference, and now impossible to ignore. The war was entering its final phase. Germany was collapsing. Allied armies were approaching the Rhine from multiple directions. The decisions made in the next 90 days would not just determine how the war ended. They would determine what Europe looked like for the next generation. And Montgomery, still in command of the 21st Army Group, still consuming resources, still watching the American armies advance on his flanks, had already identified his next objective: Berlin. He wanted it. Churchill wanted it. And Eisenhower was about to face the most consequential decision he had made since taking command of the entire Western Front. In Part 3, we will see exactly what happened when Montgomery bypassed Eisenhower's authority for the last time, and how the choice Eisenhower made at the Elbe River in April 1945 divided historians, haunted Churchill for the rest of his life, and changed the map of the Cold War before the first shot of it was ever fired. March 1945. Western Germany. The Rhine River. Montgomery had been stopped at Arnhem. The Battle of the Bulge had nearly fractured the Anglo-American alliance from the inside. Churchill had saved the coalition twice with political interventions that cost him credibility with his own military establishment. And through all of it, Eisenhower had held the line, refused to surrender command authority, and continued advancing on his broad front, while Montgomery's reputation absorbed damage that no amount of press management could fully repair. But the war was not over, and Montgomery was not finished. By March 1945, Allied armies stood at the Rhine on multiple points along a front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Germany was visibly collapsing. Hitler was directing phantom armies from a bunker beneath Berlin. German cities were burning under round-the-clock bombing. Entire army groups were being encircled and destroyed. The end was coming. The only question that still carried real strategic weight was not whether Germany would fall, but where Allied forces would be standing when it did. And that question was entirely about Berlin. German High Command understood the situation with a cold clarity that their political leadership refused to accept. By late February 1945, Wehrmacht intelligence assessments were reporting something that created genuine alarm in the remaining functional command centers. American forces were advancing faster than any projection had anticipated. The U.S. Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, had crossed the Roer River in February and was driving northeast at a pace that placed Berlin within theoretical striking distance if the advance continued unimpeded. German planners estimated that American armor, if given unobstructed priority, could reach the Elbe River within 3 to 4 weeks. The German response was brutal and deliberately targeted. Every available reserve formation that could be scraped from the collapsing Eastern Front and the remnants of the Ardennes counteroffensive was repositioned to create blocking positions along the routes leading northeast toward Berlin. Not to stop the Allies permanently. The German commanders were realistic enough to know that was impossible, but to slow the American advance long enough for the Red Army to arrive at Berlin first, because German officers who understood the post-war political situation believed that surrendering to Western forces offered substantially better outcomes than what awaited them under Soviet occupation. 42 German divisions, many under strength, but still combat effective, were identified along the axis between the Rhine and Berlin by Allied intelligence in March 1945. General Omar Bradley's staff estimated that fighting through those formations to reach Berlin would cost between 80,000 and 100,000 American casualties. Bradley presented that estimate to Eisenhower directly, without softening the number. Eisenhower did not flinch from it. He used it. On March 28, 1945, without consulting Churchill, and without clearing the message through normal diplomatic channels, Eisenhower sent a direct communication to Soviet Marshal Joseph Stalin. The message was straightforward. Western Allied forces intended to halt their main advance at the Elbe River. They would not drive on Berlin. The two Allied armies would meet in central Germany and divide the remaining German resistance between them. When Churchill read the text of that message, his reaction was not diplomatic. He sent Eisenhower a cable on March 31st that was, by the measured standards of wartime correspondence between Allied leaders, remarkably blunt. He told Eisenhower plainly that British forces risked being confined to a secondary role in the final phase of the war, and that he considered the decision to communicate directly with Stalin without prior consultation to be a serious overreach. He urged Eisenhower to reconsider to push as far into Germany as possible before halting to reach Berlin, or at minimum to advance far enough that the Western Allies held maximum leverage when negotiations with the Soviets began. Eisenhower replied with equal directness. Unless he received new orders from the combined chiefs of staff, he would follow the militarily approved plan. He was the supreme commander. The decision was his. Montgomery moved simultaneously from a different angle. On March 27, one day before Eisenhower's message to Stalin, Montgomery had sent his own memorandum to London demanding that the U.S. Ninth Army be formally attached to his 21st Army Group and given to him as the core of a Berlin thrust. He framed it as a military necessity. He described the road to Berlin as essentially open for a fast armored force with proper fuel priority. Eisenhower had anticipated exactly this. Before Montgomery's memorandum could generate political momentum in London, Eisenhower acted. He removed the U.S. Ninth Army from Montgomery's temporary operational control and returned it to Bradley's 12th Army Group. The decision was clean, decisive, and final. Montgomery's Berlin proposal died before it could be formally debated. April 11, 1945. The Elbe River, Magdeburg Sector. General William Simpson's Ninth Army reached the Elbe at multiple points and established bridgeheads on the eastern bank. Simpson assessed the situation personally. His lead divisions were less than 80 kilometers from Berlin. The road ahead was thinly defended. His armor was fueled, supplied, and battle-ready. His men were in good order after weeks of rapid advance through crumbling German resistance. Simpson drafted a request to Bradley for permission to continue the advance toward Berlin. Bradley forwarded the request to Eisenhower. The answer was no. Simpson received the order to halt at the Elbe and hold. He complied. His soldiers stood on the eastern bank of the river and looked northeast toward a city they could not approach, watching the sky in that direction fill with the distant smoke of Soviet artillery that had been building since mid-April. The Red Army had assembled 1.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and over 40,000 artillery pieces in the final assault position east of Berlin. They outnumbered anything the Western Allies could have deployed in that direction by a factor of more than 3 to 1. Eisenhower's reasoning was not timidity. It was arithmetic. Even if Simpson's lead divisions reached the outskirts of Berlin ahead of the Soviets, which was not guaranteed against the German blocking formations, they would arrive at a defended city of 4 million people with their flanks completely exposed. Their supply lines stretched over 300 kilometers of territory, still containing active German formations, and an army of 1.5 million Soviet soldiers approaching from the opposite direction who had been told the city was theirs to take. The probability of a catastrophic collision between Allied and Soviet forces in the rubble of Berlin, whether from confusion, miscommunication, or deliberate provocation, was not theoretical. It was high. Eisenhower had not come this far to start the next war while finishing the current one. April 25, 1945. Torgau, on the Elbe River. American soldiers of the 69th Infantry Division, 1st U.S. Army, crossed the Elbe in small boats and made contact with forward elements of the Soviet 58th Guards Division at the river's edge. The two armies had split Germany in two. Soldiers who had fought from different directions for 6 years shook hands on the riverbank, photographed each other, and in some cases embraced men with whom they shared no language and almost no common reference, except the fact that they were still alive. The war in Europe had 8 days remaining. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Red Army after a battle that cost the Soviets over 80,000 soldiers killed in the final assault alone. The city was rubble. The fighting inside it had been savage beyond the capacity of most language to describe, with Soviet and German forces contesting individual floors of shattered apartment buildings, sewers, subway tunnels, and burned-out factories. A Western Allied force that had fought its way in from the West would have faced the same combat with the addition of coordinating with Soviet forces closing from the East in a fluid, confused, and lethal environment. Bradley's estimate of 100,000 casualties, dismissed by some as excessively conservative, now looked like it might have been optimistic. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally at Reims. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German forces in northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands at Lüneburg Heath on May 4th. It was a moment of genuine historical weight, and Montgomery carried it with the dignity the occasion demanded. Whatever his failures of judgment, whatever the damage he had done to Allied unity, he had fought from El Alamein to the Baltic, and he had outlasted a war that killed 50 million people. That counted for something real. Eisenhower was present at the final surrender ceremony in Reims. He stood as the supreme commander of the entire Western Front, the man who had held 4 national armies together across 10 months of continuous fighting from Normandy to the Elbe, who had refused to sacrifice the coalition for any individual's ambition, including his own, and who had brought the Western Alliance to total victory with its internal structure fundamentally intact. Churchill said nothing publicly critical of Eisenhower after the war ended. He said nothing to undermine the decision on Berlin, nothing to reopen the command disputes of 1944, nothing to suggest that different choices would have produced better outcomes. Privately, in his memoirs and in closed conversations with trusted colleagues, he acknowledged regret about Berlin and about the Iron Curtain that descended across Europe within months of Germany's surrender. But he did not blame Eisenhower for the Iron Curtain. He understood with the clarity that only the passage of time can provide that the Iron Curtain had been built from decisions made at Tehran and Yalta and in the occupation zone agreements of 1944, not from Eisenhower's choice to halt at the Elbe. What Eisenhower had actually prevented was different, and Churchill understood this too. He had prevented the Anglo-American alliance from breaking apart before the war ended. He had prevented American and Soviet soldiers from shooting each other in the ruins of Berlin. He had prevented Montgomery from commanding an operation that by every honest analysis would have repeated Arnhem on a scale 4 times larger. And he had done all of it while remaining, in Churchill's own later assessment, a trusted wartime partner who successfully steered the Allied coalition through dangerous waters. The Cold War came anyway. The Iron Curtain fell anyway. Berlin became a divided city anyway. None of the things Churchill feared were prevented by the decisions made at the Rhine and the Elbe in the spring of 1945. But the Anglo-American alliance survived. It survived the command crisis of September 1944. It survived Arnhem. It survived the press conference of January 1945. It survived the argument over Berlin. And that alliance, still intact when the guns fell silent, became the foundation on which everything that followed was built. In Part 4, we will see what happened to the three men at the center of this story after the war ended, what Churchill's famous remark about Montgomery actually cost him to say, and why the decisions made in those 10 months between Normandy and the Elbe still shape the world you are living in today. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. From a single command crisis in September 1944, through the catastrophe at Arnhem, through the near collapse of Allied unity during the Battle of the Bulge, through the final argument over Berlin, Eisenhower had held the coalition together across 10 months of the most complex multinational military operation in human history. Montgomery had been stopped. Churchill had been overruled, and Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But here is the question nobody asks when they study this story. What happened to these three men after the cameras turned away? What did the war actually cost them personally? And why does a command dispute from 1944 still matter to the world you are living in right now? Because this story has a final chapter, and it is not the one you expect. Dwight Eisenhower returned to the United States in June 1945. As the most celebrated military figure in the Western world. Crowds lined the streets of Washington and New York in numbers that rivaled anything seen since the armistice of 1918. He was given the rank of General of the Army, the highest grade in the American military. He was offered the Republican presidential nomination almost immediately, an offer he declined for several years before eventually accepting it in 1952. He served 2 terms as President of the United States from 1953 to 1961, overseeing the early Cold War with the same patient coalition-minded pragmatism he had applied to managing Montgomery and Churchill. The man who had been accused of excessive caution in 1944 turned out to be exactly what the post-war world needed. Cautious enough to avoid starting a nuclear war, firm enough to build the alliances that contained Soviet expansion, practical enough to recognize that symbolic victories were worth less than durable institutions. He died in March 1969. His last public words were simple. He said he had always loved his country. He left behind a world that was by almost any honest measurement in better shape than the one he had inherited in 1944. That is not a small thing. Winston Churchill's post-war story is among the most dramatic personal reversals in the history of democratic politics. In July 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender, and while the war against Japan was still ongoing, the British electorate voted his Conservative Party out of power in a landslide. Churchill, the man who had held Britain together through its darkest hours, who had been the voice of resistance when resistance seemed irrational, who had flown to Versailles to preserve an alliance that made total victory possible, was removed from office by the people he had led through 6 years of existential war. He learned of the result at Potsdam, where he had been negotiating with Truman and Stalin over the shape of the post-war world. He flew home. He conceded gracefully. And he began writing. The 6-volume memoir he produced over the following years, The Second World War, became one of the most widely read historical accounts of the 20th century, and contributed substantially to his Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. In those volumes, Churchill was careful about Eisenhower. He praised him consistently and specifically. He described him as the man who held the alliance together. He did not relitigate the Berlin decision, did not reopen the command disputes of 1944, and did not suggest that different choices would have produced better outcomes. He had learned something in those 10 months between Normandy and the Elbe that very few political leaders of his generation managed to learn. That being right about a specific decision matters less than being right about the larger purpose those decisions serve. He had wanted Berlin. He had not gotten Berlin. And the alliance that had been preserved by not getting Berlin turned out to be worth more than Berlin. Churchill died in January 1965 at the age of 90. Eisenhower was among those who attended the state funeral in London. They had not always agreed. They had not always trusted each other's judgment. But they had built something together that outlasted both of them. Bernard Montgomery lived until 1976, long enough to watch the alliance he had nearly destroyed become the foundation of NATO, long enough to see Eisenhower serve 2 presidential terms, and long enough to continue arguing in interviews and memoirs and public appearances well into old age that he had been right in September 1944, and that the war could have been ended before Christmas if Eisenhower had simply listened. He was never able to let it go. And that inability revealed something true about him that his military record alone could not. Montgomery was a genuinely brilliant tactician who understood the mechanics of battle with rare precision. He was also a man constitutionally incapable of the kind of self-examination that would have allowed him to acknowledge error. Arnhem was always 90% successful. The press conference after the bulge was always misinterpreted. The command crisis of September 1944 was always Eisenhower's fault for lacking boldness. Churchill's famous remark about Montgomery, the one that became the most quoted line of his entire wartime career, was delivered in a private meeting shortly after the war ended. In defeat, unbeatable. In victory, unbearable. It was half admiring and half devastating. And it captured something that took 10 months of active coalition management to fully understand. Montgomery's greatest strength and his greatest weakness were the same thing. He was absolutely certain he was right. That certainty made him ferocious in adversity and impossible in success. The legacy of what Eisenhower built in those 10 months is not primarily military. It is institutional. The decision to hold the alliance together rather than win a faster victory under a single commander established a template for multinational military cooperation that shaped every major Western military operation for the next 80 years. NATO, founded in 1949, was built explicitly on the model of integrated Allied command that Eisenhower had defended against Montgomery's attempts to concentrate authority in a single national commander. The principle that no one nation's general would exercise unilateral control over another nation's armies, that coalition decisions required consensus and mutual respect rather than hierarchy imposed by the strongest, came directly from the experience of managing the Western Front between 1944 and 1945. 57 nations have participated in NATO operations since its founding. The alliance has never fought a war against another nuclear power. Whether that outcome reflects the alliance's deterrent strength or simply good fortune is a question historians will debate indefinitely. But the structure that produced it was designed by a man who had spent 10 months in 1944 and 1945 refusing to let personal ambition or national pride override collective purpose. Eisenhower himself was direct about this in his memoirs. He wrote that he would rather advance toward Berlin with American and British forces moving side by side than rush there alone, and look back to find the alliance in ruins behind him. That sentence contains the entire philosophy of coalition warfare in 29 words. It also contains the answer to every criticism Montgomery ever made of the broad front strategy. The 3 lessons this story teaches are not complicated, but they are consistently ignored by people in positions of authority across every field and every generation. The first is that the most dangerous person in any coalition is not the enemy outside. It is the brilliant, indispensable member inside who believes his vision is so clearly correct that the normal rules of cooperation do not apply to him. Montgomery was not wrong that a concentrated thrust might have produced results faster than the broad front. He was catastrophically wrong that his certainty about this justified bypassing command authority, leaking to the press, threatening resignation, and appealing directly to political leaders over the heads of his military superiors. Organizations that tolerate this behavior because the individual is talented enough eventually discover that the talent is not worth the structural damage. The second lesson is about the difference between winning a battle and winning a war. Churchill wanted Berlin. Montgomery wanted Berlin. Both men believed with reasonable justification that capturing Berlin before the Soviets would have produced better post-war political outcomes for the Western Allies. They may even have been correct about that in a narrow tactical sense. But Eisenhower understood that winning the argument about Berlin while fracturing the alliance would cost more than losing the argument while keeping the coalition intact. He chose the coalition. History has not clearly proven him wrong. The third lesson is the hardest one to internalize because it runs against everything that modern culture tells us about leadership. The most important decisions made by the most consequential leaders are often the ones where they chose not to act, not to advance, not to escalate, not to press the advantage to its absolute limit. Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe, his decision not to dismiss Montgomery after Arnhem, his decision to absorb the political pressure from Churchill without either surrendering to it or responding with open confrontation, these were not failures of nerve. They were acts of strategic discipline that required more genuine courage than any armored thrust across northern Germany. Now here is the detail that almost no account of this story includes, and it changes the way you understand everything that came before it. In 1951, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of NATO, the first person to hold that position. When he arrived in Europe to establish the new command structure, one of the first visits he made was to Bernard Montgomery, who had been appointed as NATO's first Deputy Supreme Commander. The two men who had nearly destroyed the Anglo-American alliance in September 1944 were now required to build the permanent institutional structure of Western defense together. By every account of those working in the NATO headquarters at the time, they were professional, respectful, and cooperative. The arguments of 1944 were not relitigated. The old grievances were not reopened in any way that damaged the work. Montgomery, who had spent 6 years telling anyone who would listen that Eisenhower had lacked boldness, worked under Eisenhower's authority at NATO, without the public confrontations that had characterized their wartime relationship. And Eisenhower, who had told his chief of staff that Montgomery was trying to fire him, extended enough professional respect to make the partnership functional. Whether this represented genuine reconciliation or simply two old soldiers recognizing that the work mattered more than the argument, nobody who was present left a clear account. What they left was the institution itself. NATO, still functioning, still the central structure of Western collective defense, still organized around the principle that Eisenhower defended at Versailles in September 1944, that no coalition survives when one member's ambition overrides the collective purpose. From a supply officer's son from Abilene, Kansas, who graduated in the middle of his class at West Point and spent most of his pre-war career doing administrative work, to Supreme Commander of the largest military alliance in human history, Eisenhower proved that the quality most necessary in a coalition leader is not brilliance, not boldness, not the ability to inspire troops with theatrical certainty. It is the willingness to absorb pressure from every direction without losing sight of the single thing that matters most. He saved the alliance. The alliance won the war. And everything built in the 70 years since was constructed on that foundation. That is why this story is worth telling. And that is why it is not finished yet. If you have watched all 4 parts of this series, you have just spent 90 minutes with 3 of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, at the most consequential moment of their lives. Share this with someone who thinks history is just dates and battles. Because what actually happened was something much more human than that. It was 3 men, each convinced he was right, trying to figure out which of them was right about what actually mattered. Only one of them got the answer correct, and the world he left behind is the proof.